Hi readers, welcome back to Reads with Rune B with me, Rune B, and my partner in crime,
Robert.
And today we are continuing on with Oliver Twist. And we are on chapter 14.
14.
Hooray! I can read Roman numerals, everyone. Comprising further particulars of Oliver's stay at Mr. Brownlow's, with remarkable prediction, which one Mr. Grimwig uttered concerning him, when he went out on an errand.
Oliver soon recovered from the fainting fit into which Mr. Brownlow's abrupt exclamation had thrown him, and subject of the picture was carefully avoided, both by the old gentleman and Mrs. Bedwin, in the conversation that ensued, which indeed bore no reference to Oliver's history or prospects, but was confined to such topics as might amuse. Without exciting him, he was still too weak to get up to breakfast, but when he came down into the housekeeper's room the next day, his first act was to cast an eager glance at the wall in the hope of again looking on the face of the beautiful lady. His expectations were disappointed, however, for the picture had been removed.
Ah,
Said the housekeeper, watching the directions of Oliver's eyes.
it is gone, you see,
I see it is, ma'am.
replied Oliver with a sigh.
Why have they taken it away?
It has been taken down, child, because Mr. Brownlow said that, as it seemed to worry you, perhaps it might prevent you getting well. And, well, you know.
Rejoined the old lady.
Oh no, indeed, it didn't worry me, Mum,
said Oliver.
I liked to see it. I quite loved it,
Well, well,
said the old woman good-humouredly.
You'll get it. You get well at fast, as ever you can, dear, and it shall be hung up again. There, I promise you that. Now let us talk about something else.
And this is all the information Oliver could obtain about the picture at this time. As the old lady had been so kind to him in his illness, he endeavoured to think of it no more on the subject just then. So he listened attentively to a great many stories she told him about the amiable and handsome daughter of hers, who was married to an amiable and handsome man who lived in the country, and about a son who was a clerk to a merchant in the West Indies, who was also such a good young man, and wrote such dutiful letters home 4 times a year, and that it brought tears to our eyes to talk about them. When the old lady had expatiated a long time on the excellences of her children, and the merits of her good kind husband besides, who had been dead and gone, poor soul, just 26 years, it was time to have tea, and after tea she began to teach Oliver cribbage, and which he learned as quickly as she could teach him, and at which game they played with great interest and gravity, until it was time for the invalid to have some warm wine and water, with a slice of dry toast, and then go cozily to bed.
They were happy. They were happy days, those of Oliver's recovery. Everything was so quiet and neat and orderly. Everybody so kind and gentle that the noise of turbulence in the midst of which he had always lived, it seemed like heaven itself. He was no sooner strong enough to put his clothes on properly than Mr. Brownlow caused a complete new suit and a new cap and a new pair of shoes to be provided for him, as Oliver was told that he might do what he liked with the old clothes. He gave them to a servant who had been very kind to him, and asked her to sell to a Jew and keep the money for herself. This she very readily did, and as Oliver looked out the parlour window and saw the Jew roll them up into his bag and walked away, he felt quite delighted to think that they were safely gone, and that there was no possible danger of his ever being able to wear them again. They were sad rags, to tell the truth, and Oliver had never had a new suit before.
One evening, about a week after the affair of the picture, he was sitting and talking to Mrs. Bedwin, when there came a message from Mr. Brownlow that if Oliver Twist felt pretty well, he should like to see him in his study and talk to him a little while.
Bless us and save us. Wash your hands and let me part your hair nicely for you, child.
said Miss Bedwin.
Dear heart alive, if we had known he would have asked you, we would have put you in a clean collar on and made you as smart as sixpence.
Oliver did as the old lady bade him, and although she lamented grievously meanwhile that there was not even enough time to crimp the little frill that bordered his shirt collar, he looked so delicate and handsome, despite an important personal advantage, that she went so far as to say, looking at him with great complacency from head to toe, that she really didn't think it would have been possible on longest notice to have made much difference in him for the better.
Thus encouraged, Oliver tapped at the study door on Mr. Brownlow, calling him to come in. He found himself in a little back room quite full of books, with a window looking into some pleasant little gardens. There was a table drawn up the window at which Mr. Brownlow was seated reading. He saw Oliver. He pushed the book away from him and told him to come near the table and sit down. Oliver complied, marvelling where the people could be found to read such a great number of books as seemed to be written to make the world wiser, which is still a marvel to more experienced people than Oliver Twist, every day of their lives.
There are a good many books here, are there not, my boy?
Said Mr. Brownlow, observing the curiosity with which Oliver surveyed the shelves that reached from the floor to the ceiling.
A great number, sir,
replied Oliver.
I never saw so many.
You should read them, if you behave well,
said the old gentleman kindly.
And you will like that better than looking at the outside. That is some case, because there are books of which the backs and covers are far the best part.
I suppose they are those heavy ones, sir,
said Oliver, pointing some large quartus with a good detail of gilding about the binding.
Not always those,
said the old gentleman, patting Oliver on the head and smiling as he did so.
There are some other equally heavy ones, though of a much smaller size. How should you like to grow up a clever man and write books, hey?
I think I would rather read them, sir,
replied Oliver.
What? Wouldn't you like to be a book writer? The old gentleman said.
Oliver considered a little while, and at last he said he should think it would be a much better thing to be a bookseller, upon which the old gentleman heartily laughed and declared that he had said a very good thing, which Oliver felt glad to have done, though by no means he knew what it was.
Well, well,
said the old gentleman, composing his features.
Don't be afraid. We won't make an author of you while there are an honest trade to be learned or brickmaking to turn to.
Thank you, sir,
said Oliver. At the earnest manner of his reply, the old gentleman laughed again, and said something about a curious instinct which Oliver, not understanding, paid no very great attention to.
Now,
said Mr. Brownlow, speaking, if possible, in a kinder, but at the same time in a much more serious manner than Oliver had ever known him assume yet.
I want you to pay great attention, my boy, to what I am going to say. I shall talk with you without any reserve, because I am sure you are well able to understand, as many older persons would be.
Oh, don't tell me you're going to send me away, sir, pray,
exclaimed Oliver, alarmed at the seriousness of the old gentleman's tone and countenance.
Don't turn me out of the door to wander the streets again. Let me stay here and be a servant. Don't send me back to the wretched place I came from. Have mercy upon a poor boy, sir.
My dear child,
said the old gentleman, moved by the warmth of Oliver's sudden appeal.
You need not be afraid of my deserting you, unless you give me cause.
I never will, sir,
interposed Oliver.
I hope not,
rejoined the old gentleman.
I don't think you ever will. I hope not. I have been deceived before in the objects whom I have endeavoured to benefit, but I feel strongly disposed to trust you nevertheless. I am more interested in your behalf than I can well account for, even to myself. The person on whom I have bestowed my dearest love lies deep in their graves. But although the happiness and delight of my life lives buried there, too, I have not made a coffin of my heart and sealed it up forever. On on my best affections, deep affections,
Deep affection.
deep affections has but strengthened the refinement of them, as an old gentleman.
As the old gentleman said this in a low voice, more to himself than his companion, he remained silent for a short time afterwards, and Oliver sat quite still.
Well, well,
Said the old gentleman at length, in a more cheerful tone.
I only say this because you have a young heart, and knowing that I have suffered great pain and sorrow, you will be more careful, perhaps, not to wound me again. You say you are an orphan without a friend in the world. All the inquiries I have been able to make confirm this statement. Let me hear your story, where you come from, who brought you up, and how you got into the company in which I found you. Speak the truth, and shall not be friendless while I live.
Oliver's sobs checked his utterance for some minutes. When he was on the point of beginning to relate how he had been brought up on the farm and carried to the workhouse by Mr. Bumble, a particularly impatient little knock was heard at the street door, and the servant running up the stairs announced Mr. Grimwig.
Is he coming up?
Yes, sir,
replied the servant.
He asked if there were any muffins in the house, and when I told him yes, he said he'd come to tea.
Mr. Brownlow smiled and turned to Oliver, said that Mr. Grimwig was an old friend of his. He must not mind his being a little rough in his manners, for he is a worthy creature at bottom, as he had reason to know.
Shall I go downstairs, sir?
Inquired Oliver.
No,
replied Mr. Brownlow.
I would rather you remained here.
At this moment, they walked into the room, supporting himself by a thick stick, a stout old gentleman, rather lame in one leg, who was dressed in a blue coat, striped waistcoat, nankee breeches and gaiters, and a broad-brimmed white hat with the sides turned up with green. A very small plaited shirt frill stuck out from his waistcoat, with a very long steel watch chain with nothing but a key at the end, dangled loosely below it. The ends of his white neckerchief were twisted into a ball about the size of an orange. The variety of shapes into which his countenance was twisted defied description. He had a manner of screwing his head on one side when he spoke, and of looking out of the corner of his eye at the same time, which irresistibly reminded the beholder of a parrot. In this attitude he fixed himself the moment he made his appearance, and holding out a small piece of orange peel at arm's length, exclaimed, in a disattoned voice. Discontented.
Look here, do you see this? Isn't it the most wonderful and extraordinary thing that I can't call at a man's house but find this poor surgeon's friend on the staircase? I've been lamed with orange peel once, and I know orange peel will be my death at last. It will, sir. Orange peel will be my death, or I'll be content to eat my own head, sir.
This was a handsome offer with which Mr. Grimwig backed and confirmed nearly every assertion he made, and it was the more singular in his case because, even admitting, for the sake of argument, the possibility of scientific improvements being ever brought to that pass which will enable a gentleman to eat his own head in the event of him being so disposed, Mr. Grimwig's head was such a particularly large one that the most sanguine man alive could hardly entertain a hope of being able to get through it in a sitting. To put entirely out of the question a very thick coating of powder.
I'll eat my head, sir,
repeated Mr. Grimwig, striking his stick upon the ground.
Oh, what's that?
Looking at Oliver and retreating a pace or two.
This is young Oliver Twist, whom we were speaking about,
said Mr. Brownlow.
Oliver bowed.
You don't mean to say that the boy who had the fever, I hope?
said Mr. Grimwig, recoiling a little more.
Wait a minute, don't speak, stop,
continued Mr. Grimwig, abruptly losing all dread of the fever in his triumph at the discovery.
That's the boy who had the orange. If that's not the boy, sir, who had the orange and threw this bit of peel upon the staircase, I'll eat my head and his too.
No, no, he is not the one,
said Mr. Brownlow, laughing.
Come, put your hat down and speak to my young friend.
I feel strongly on the subject, sir,
said the irritable old gentleman, drawing off his gloves.
There's always more or less orange peel on that pavement in our streets, and I know it's put there by the surgeon's boy at the corner. A young woman stumbled over a bit last night and fell against my garden railings. Directly she got up, I saw her look towards his infernal red lamp, and with the pantomime light,
Don't go to him,
I called out of the window.
He's an assassin, a man-trap. So he is, if he's not. Here
the
irascible old gentleman gave a great knock on the ground with his stick, which was always understood by his friends to imply a customary offer, whenever it was not expressed in words. Then, still keeping his stick in his hand, he sat down, and opening a double eyeglass, which he wore attached to a broad black ribbon, and took view of Oliver, who, seeing he was the object of inspection, coloured and bowed again.
That's the boy, is it?
said Mr. Grimwig at length.
That is the boy,
replied Mr. Brownlow.
How are you, boy?
said Mr. Grimwig.
A great deal better, thank you, sir,
replied Oliver. Mr. Brownlow, seeming to apprehend that his singular friend was about to say something disagreeable, asked Oliver to step downstairs and tell Miss Bedwin they were ready for tea, which, as he did not half like the visitor's manner, he was very happy to do.
He's a nice-looking boy, is he not?
inquired Mr. Brownlow.
I don't know,
replied Mr. Grimwig pettishly.
Don't know.
No, I don't. I never see any difference in boys. I only know two sorts of boys, mealy boys and beef-faced boys.
And which is Oliver?
Mealy. I know a friend who has a beef-faced boy, a fine boy they call him, with a round head, red cheeks and glaring eyes, a horrid boy, with body and limbs that appear to be swelling out the seams of his blue clothes, with the voice of a pilot and the appetite of a wolf. I know him, that wretch.
Come,
said Mr. Brownlow.
These are not the characteristics of young Oliver Twist, so he needn't excite your wrath.
They are not,
replied Mr. Grimwig.
He may have worse.
Here Mr. Brownlow coughed impatiently, which appeared to afford Mr. Grimwig the most exquisite delight.
He may have worse, I say,
repeated Mr. Grimwig.
Where does he come from? Who is he? What is he? He has had a fever. What of that? Fevers are not particular to good people, are they? Bad people have fevers sometimes, haven't they, hey? I knew a man who was hung in Jamaica for murdering his master. He had a fever 6 times. He wasn't recommended to mercy on account of it. Pooh! Nonsense!
Now the fact was that in the inmost recesses of his own heart, Mr. Grimwig was strongly disposed to admit that Oliver's appearance and manner were unusually prepossessing, but he had a strong appetite for contradictions sharpened on the occasion by the findings of the orange peel, and inwardly determined that no man should dictate to him whether a boy was well looking or not. He had resolved from first to oppose his friend when Mr. Brownlow admitted that no one point of inquiry could yet return to a satisfactory answer, and that had thought the boy was strong enough to bear it. Mr. Grimwig chuckled maliciously, and he demanded with a sneer whether the housekeeper was in the habit of counting the plates at night, because if she didn't find a tablespoon or two missing some sunshiny morning why he would be content to, and forth so.
All this, Mr. Brownlow, although he himself somewhat an impetuous gentleman, knowing his friend's peculiarities, bore this with great good humour. As Mr. Grimwig at tea was graciously pleased to express his entire approval of the muffins, the matters went on very smoothly, and Oliver, who made one of the party, began to feel more at his ease, as he had yet done in the fierce old gentleman's presence.
And when are you going to hear the full, true, and particular account of the life and adventures of Oliver Twist?
Asked Mr. Grimwig of Mr. Brownlow at the conclusion of the meal, looking sideways at Oliver as he resumed the subject.
Tomorrow morning,
replied Mr. Brownlow.
I'd rather he was alone with me at the time. Come up to me tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, my dear.
Yes, sir,
replied Oliver, answering with some hesitation, because he was confused by Mr. Grimwig's looking so hard at him.
I'll tell you what,
whispered the gentleman to Mr. Brownlow.
He won't come up to you tomorrow morning. I saw him hesitate. He is deceiving you, my good friend.
I'll swear he's not,
replied Mr. Brownlow warmly.
If he is not, said if he's not,
said Mr. Grimwig,
I'll and
down the stick went.
I'll answer for the boy's truth with my life,
said Mr. Brownlow, knocking the table.
And I for his falsehood with my head,
rejoined Mr. Grimwig, knocking the table also.
We shall see,
Mr. Brownlow said, checking his rising anger.
We will,
replied Mr. Grimwig with a provoking smile.
We will.
As fate would have it, Miss Bedwin chanced to bring in at this moment a small parcel of books, which Mr. Brownlow had that morning purchased of the identical bookstall keeper who had already figured in this history, and having laid them on the table, she prepared to leave the room.
Stop the boy, Mrs. Bedwin, said
Mr. Brownlow.
There is something to go back.
He is gone, sir,
replied Mrs. Bedwin.
Call after him,
said Mr. Brownlow.
It's particular, the poor man, and they are not paid for, and there are some books to be taken back too.
The street door was opened. Oliver ran one way and the girl ran another, and Mrs. Bedwin stood in the steps screaming for the boy, but there was no boy in sight. Oliver and the girl returned in a breathless state to report that there was no tidings of him.
Dear me, I'm very sorry for that, exclaimed
Mr. Brownlow.
I particularly wish those books to be returned tonight.
Send Oliver with them,
said Mr. Grimwig with an ironical smile.
He will be sure to deliver them safely, you know.
Yes, let me take them, if you please, sir,
said Oliver.
I'll run all the way.
The old gentleman was just going to say that Oliver should not go out on any account, when a most malicious cough from Mr. Grimwig determined him that he should, and that by his prompt discharge of the commission he should prove to him unjust of his suspicions, and on this head at least at once. You should go, my dear, said the old gentleman. The books are on a chair by my table. Fetch them down. Oliver, delighted to be of use, brought down the books under his arm in a great bustle, and waited, cap in hand, to hear what message he was to take. You are to say, said Mr. Brownlow, glancing steadily at Grimwig. You are to say that you have brought these books back, and that you have come to pay the £4.10 I owe him. This is a £5 note. You will have to bring me back the 10-shilling change. I won't be 10 minutes, sir, replied Oliver eagerly, having buttoned up the banknote in his jacket pocket and placed the books carefully under his arm. He made a respectful bow and left the room. Mrs. Bedwin followed him to the street door, giving him many directions about the nearest way to the name of the bookseller, and the name of the street, all which Oliver said he clearly understood, and having
Superadded many injunctions to be sure not to take cold, the old lady at length permitted him to depart.
Bless his sweet face,
said the old lady, looking after him.
I can't bear somehow. I let him go out of my sight.
At this very moment, Oliver looked gaily around and nodded before he turned the corner. The old lady smilingly returned his salutation, and closing the door, went back to her own rooms.
Let me see, he'll be back in 20 minutes at the longest,
said Mr. Brownlow, pulling out his watch and placing it on the table.
It'll be dark by that time.
Oh, you really expect him to come back, do you?
Inquired Mr. Grimwig.
Don't you?
Asked Mr. Brownlow, smiling.
The spirit of contradiction was strong in Mr. Grimwig's breast. At the moment it was rendered stronger by his friend's confident smile.
No,
he said, smiting the table with his fist.
I do not. The boy has a new suit of clothing on his back, a set of valuable books under his arms, and a £5 note in his pocket. He'll join his old friends, the thieves, and laugh at you. If ever that boy returns to this house, sir, I'll eat my head.
With these words, he drew his chair closer to the table, and then the two friends sat in silent expectation, with the watch between them. It is worthy to remark, as illustrating the importance we attach to our own judgments, the pride with which we put forth our most rash and hasty conclusions, that although Mr. Grimwig was not by any means a bad-hearted man, and that though he would have been unfeignedly sorry to see his respected friend duped and deceived, he really did most earnestly and hope at that very moment that Oliver Twist might not come back. It grew so dark that the two figures on the dial plate were scarcely discernible, but the two old gentlemen continued to sit in silence and watch with the watch between them.
Chapter 15.
Showing how the very fond Oliver Twist and the merry old Jew and Nancy were.
In the obscure parlour of a low public house situated in the filthiest part of the little Saffron Hill, a dark and gloomy den where a flaring gaslight burnt all day in the winter time, and where no ray of sun ever shone in the summer, there sat a brooding over a little pewter measure and a small glass strongly impregnated with the smell of liquor, a man in a velvety coat, drab shorts, half boots, and stockings, whom even by a dim light no experienced agent of police would have hesitated for one instant to recognise as Mr. William Sikes. As his feet sat a white-coated, red-eyed dog who occupied himself, alternating in winking at his master with both eyes, at the same time in a licking and large fresh cut on one side of his mouth, which appeared to be the result of some recent conflict.
"Keep quiet, you warmint, keep quiet,"
said Mr. Sikes, suddenly breaking silence, whether his meditations were so intense as to be disturbed by the dog's winking, or whether his feelings were so wrought upon by his reflections that required all the relief derivable by the kicking an unoffending animal to ally them in matters of argument and consideration. Whatever was the cause and effect was a kick and a cause bestowed upon the dogs simultaneously.
Dogs are not generally apt to take revenge for injuries inflicted upon them by their masters, but Mr. Sikes' dog, having faults of temper in common with his owner, and labouring perhaps at this moment under a powerful sense of injury, made no more ado, but at once fixed his teeth into one of the half-boots. Giving it a hearty shake, he retired, growling under a form, thereby just escaping the pewter measure which Mr. Sikes had levelled at his head.
Would you?
said Sikes, seizing a poker in one hand and deliberately opening with the other a large clasp knife he drew from his pocket.
Come here, you born devil, come here, you dear.
The dog no doubt heard, because Mr. Sikes spoke in the very harshest key of a very harsh voice, but appearing to entertain some unaccountable objection to having his throat cut, he remained where he was, and growled more fiercely than ever before, at the same time grasping the end of the poker between his teeth and biting at it like a wild beast.
This resistance only infuriated Mr. Sikes the more, dropping on his knees, began to assail the animal most furiously. The dog jumped up from right to left and from left to right, snapping, growling, and barking. The man thrust and swore and struck and blasphemed, and the struggle was reached the most critical point for one or other when the door suddenly opened. The dog darted out, leaving Bill Sikes and the poker and the clasp knife in his hands.
There must always be two parties to a quarrel, says the old adage, and Mr. Sikes, being disappointed of the dog's participation, at once transferred his share of the quarrel to the newcomer.
"What the devil do you come in between me and my dog for?"
said Sikes with a fierce gesture.
"I don't know, my dear, I don't know,"
replied Fagin humbly, for the Jew was the newcomer.
"Didn't know, you white-livered thief,"
growled Sikes.
"Couldn't you hear the noise?"
"Not a sound of it, as I'm a living man, Bill,"
replied the Jew.
"Oh no, you'd hear nothing, don't you?"
retorted Sikes with a fierce sneer.
"Sneaking in and out so as nobody hears how you come or go. I wish you'd been the dog, Fagin, just half a minute ago."
"Why?"
inquired the Jew with a forced smile.
"'Cause the government as cares for for the living of such men as you, as half have the pluck of curs, let a man kill a dog as how he likes,"
replied Sikes, shutting up the knife with a very expressive look.
"That's why."
The Jew rubbed his hands, and sitting down at table, affected to laugh at the pleasantry of his friend. He was obviously very ill at ease, however.
"Grin away,"
said Sikes, replacing the poker, and surveying him with savage contempt.
"Grin away, you'll never have the laugh at me, though, unless it's behind a nightcap. I've got the upper hand over you, Fagin, and damn me, I'll keep it there. If I go, you go, and so take care of me."
"Well, well, my dear," said the Jew. I know all that. We have a mutual interest, Bill, a mutual interest," said Sikes, as though he thought the interest lay rather more in the Jew's side than on his.
"Well, what have you got to say to me?"
"It's all passed safely through the melting pot,"
replied Fagin.
"and this is your share. It's rather more than it ought to be, my dear, but I know you'll do me a good turn another time, and—"
"Stow the gammon,"
interposed the robber impatiently.
"Where is it? Hand over."
Yes, Bill. Give me time, replied the Jew. "Here it is, all safe."
As he spoke, he drew forth an old cotton handkerchief from his breast, and untying a large knot in one corner, produced a small brown paper packet. Sikes, snatching it from him, hastily opened it and proceeded to count the sovereigns it contained.
"Is this all?"
inquired Sikes.
"All,"
replied the Jew.
"You haven't opened the parcel and swallowed one or two as you came along, have you?" inquired
Sikes suspiciously.
"Don't put on that injured look at the question. You've done it many a time. Jerk the tinkler."
These words, in plain English, conveyed the injunction to ring the bell. It was answered by the Jew,
by another Jew,
younger than Fagin, but nearly as vile and repulsive in appearance.
Bill Sikes merely pointed to the empty measure. The Jew, perfectly understanding the hint, retired to fill it, previously exchanging a remarkable look with Fagin, who raised his eyes for an instant as if in expectation of it, and shook his head in reply so slightly that the action would have been almost imperceptible to an observant third person. It was lost upon Sikes, who was stooping at the moment to tie the bootlace which the dog had torn. Possibly, if he had observed the brief interchange of signals, he might have thought it boded no good to him.
Is anybody here, Barney?
inquired Fagin, speaking now that Sikes was looking on, without raising his eyes from the ground.
Not a soul.
Replied Barney. Those words, whether they came from the heart or not, made their way through the nose.
Nobody?
Inquired Fagin with a tone of surprise, which might mean that Barney was at liberty to tell the truth.
Nobody but this Desi.
Replied Barney.
Nancy?
Exclaimed Sikes.
Where? Strike me blind if I don't honour that 'ere girl for her native talents.
She'd have a plate of boiled beef in the bar, sir.
Replied Barney.
Send her here.
Said Sikes, pouring out a glass of liquor.
Send her here.
Barney looked timid at Fagin, as if for permission. The Jew remained silent, and not lifting his eyes from the ground, he retired, and presently returned, ushering in Nancy, who was decorated with the bonnet, apron, basket, and street door key complete.
Are you on the scent, Nancy? Are you?
Inquired Sikes, proffering the glass.
Yes, I am, Bill.
Replied the young lady, disposing of its contents.
And tired enough of it I am too. The young brat's been ill and confined to a crib, and
Nancy, dear,
said Fagin, looking up. Now, whether a particular contraction of the Jew's red eyebrows and half-closing of his deep-set eyes warned Miss Nancy that she was disposed to be too communicative is not much matter for importance. The fact is that all we need care for here, and that fact is that she suddenly checked herself, and with sudden and several gracious smiles upon Mr. Sikes, turned the conversation to other matters. In about 10 minutes, Mr. Fagin was seized with a fit of coughing, upon which Miss Nancy pulled her shawl over her shoulders and declared it was time to go. Mr. Sikes, finding that he was walking a short part of her way himself, expressed his intention of accompanying her, and they went away together, followed at a little distance by the dog, who slunk out of the backyard as soon as his master was out of sight.
The Jew, thrusting his head out the room door with Sikes, when Sikes had left it, looked after him as he walked up the dark passage, shook his clenched fist, muttering a deep curse, and then, with a horrible grin, reseated himself at the table, where he would soon deeply absorbed into his interesting pages of the hue and cry.
Meanwhile, Oliver Twist, little dreaming that he was within so very short a distance of the merry old gentleman, was on his way to the bookstall. When he got into Clerkenwell, he accidentally turned down a by-street, which was not exactly in his way, but not discovering his mistake until he got halfway down it, and knowing it must lead in the right direction, he did not think it worthwhile to turn back, and so marched on, as quickly as he could, with the books under one arm. He was walking along, thinking how happy and contented he ought to feel, and how much he would give for only one look at poor little Dick, who starved and beaten might be weeping bitterly at this very moment, when he was startled by a young woman screaming out very loudly,
"Oh, my dear brother!"
He had hardly looked up to see what the matter was when he was stopped by having a pair of arms thrown tightly about his neck.
"Don't!"
cried Oliver, struggling.
"Let go of me! Who is it? What are you stopping me for?"
The only reply to this was a great number of loud lamentations from the young woman who had embraced him, and who had the little basket and the street door key in her hand.
"Oh, my gracious!"
said the young woman.
"I found him! Oh, Oliver, Oliver, you naughty boy! To make me suffer such distress on your good account. Come here, dear, come. I found him. Thank gracious goodness heavens, I found him."
With these incoherent explanations, the young woman burst into another fit of crying, and got so dreadfully hysterical that a couple of women who came up at that very moment asked a butcher's boy with a shiny head of hair anointed with suet, who was also looking on, whether he didn't think he had better run and fetch the doctor. To which the butcher's boy, who had appeared to be a bit of a lounge, not to say indolent disposition, replied that he thought not.
"Oh, no, never mind,"
said the young woman, grasping Oliver's hand.
"I'm better now. Come home directly, you cruel boy. Come,"
What's the matter, ma'am?
inquired one of the women.
Oh, ma'am,
Replied the young woman.
he ran away near a month ago from his parents, who are hard-working and respectable people, and went to join a set of thieves and bad characters, and almost broke his poor mother's dear heart,
"Young wretch,
said one woman.
go home, do you, little brute?"
Said another,
"I'm not,"
replied Oliver, greatly alarmed.
"I don't know her. I haven't a sister or a father or a mother either. I'm an orphan. I live at Pentonville."
Oh, only hear him, how he braves it out.
Cried the young woman.
Why, it's Nancy,
Exclaimed Oliver, who saw her face for the first time, and started back in irresponsible astonishment.
You see, he knows me.
Cried Nancy, appealing to the
He
bystanders.
can't help himself. Make him come home. There's good people, or he'll kill his dear mother and father and break my heart,
"What the devil is this?"
said the man, bursting out of a beer shop with a white dog at his heels.
"Young Oliver, come home to your poor mother, you young dog. Come home directly,"
I don't belong to them. I don't know them. Help, help,
cried Oliver, struggling in the man's powerful grasp.
help.
Repeated the man.
I'll help you, you young rascal. What are these books? You've been a-stealing them, haven't you? Give 'em here. And with these... Oh,
Give him here. With these words, the man tore the volumes from his grasp and struck him on the head.
that's right.
Cried a looker-on from a garret window.
That's the only way to bring him to his senses,
"To be sure,"
cried a sleepy-faced carpenter, casting an approving look to the garret window.
"I'll do him good,
Said the two women,
and he shall have it too,"
rejoined the man, administering another blow, and seizing Oliver by the collar.
"Come on, you young villain. Here's Bullseye. Mind him, boy. Mind him."
Weak with recent illness, stupefied by the blows and the suddenness of the attack, terrified by the fierce growling dog and the brutality of the man, and overpowered by the conviction of the bystanders that he really was the hardened little wretch that he had been described to be, what could one poor child do? Darkness had set in. It was a low neighborhood. There was no help near. Resistance was useless. In another moment he was dragged into a labyrinth of dark narrow courts, and forced along them at a pace which rendered the few cries he dared to give utterance to wholly unintelligible. It was a little moment, indeed, whether they were intelligible or no, for nobody cared for them, if they had ever been so plain.
The gas lamps were lightened. Mrs. Bedwin was waiting anxiously at the open door. The servant had run up the street 20 times to see if there were any traces of Oliver, and still the two old gentlemen sat preservingly in the dark parlour, with the watch between them.
And here is an illustration of what happened to Oliver.
The poor guy.
Yeah, the poor boy. Let's see what happens next. But that is for our next adventure. So hopefully we'll see you next time, readers. Thank you very much for joining us. Stay safe, be excellent, and keep reading. Bye for now.